More troops to Iraq. 450 more Americans will join the effort to train Iraqi forces in the fight against ISIS. Catholics mistreated. As the Pope meets with the Russian president, a rare look at that country's Catholic minority. Solid direction. Cardinal Dolan assures the Synod on the Family will stand firm on church teaching. And what a find! An ancient church is discovered in Jerusalem. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, June 10th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. The White House says the United States will send up to 450 more troops to Iraq to boost the training of local forces. This is a response to recent setbacks at the hands of the Islamic State. But the president will not send combat troops back to the region.
The president's been clear about what's not on the table, and that is a large-scale ground combat operation inside of Iraq. And the reason the president has ruled out that option is the president does not believe it is in the national security interest of the United States for us to do for the Iraqis what they must do for themselves.
House Speaker John Boehner says sending the military advisors to Iraq is a step in the right direction. However, today he repeatedly criticized the president for not having an overreaching strategy for dealing with the Islamic State. Iraq's second largest city, along with a third of that country, fell to the Islamic State a year ago. Today, little has changed in spite of U.S.-led airstrikes on ISIS positions. Jason Calvi is here to report on the millions still displaced.
Brian, many Mosul residents were given the choice 1 year ago. Convert, run, or die. Many died, but Iraqis who got away are living in the northern Kurdish region of Iraq. 3 million live in refugee camps or shelters. More than 1,400 Iraqis live in this camp in Erbil, Iraq. Abu Zaid al-Jabori is one of them. He says it's impossible to think he's been away from his hometown of Mosul for a year. He says it's a sad, painful anniversary. 1 year ago, ISIS captured Mosul, and people fled for their lives. The UN says 8.2 million Iraqis will need humanitarian assistance this year. And the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom says the world needs to help.
Proper food, shelter, clothing, medical care, psychological care for the women, children, and young boys that are targeted by ISIL, who are raped, murdered, slaughtered.
The Iraqi forces are fighting, but ISIS still controls large areas in Syria and Iraq.
They are well organized, they know what their targets are, and they know how to go after them. They fight strategically, they think strategically.
Iraqi expert Edmund Gharib says the U.S. could stop the Islamic State.
There's no doubt if the U.S. decides to send sufficient number of troops, they could overcome and defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The question is, are they willing to invest?
It's a question that'll impact Abu's future. He calls it a black anniversary and says mourning is in order. As the war grinds on, Iraqi authorities admit that many may never return. With towns destroyed in the fighting and infrastructure severely damaged, it's causing anger and disappointment among Iraqis. Brian?
Jason Calvi, thank you. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Pope Francis receives Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Vatican today. The Pope calls for a sincere effort aimed at bringing peace to Ukraine. Their talks focused on the Ukraine conflict and the Middle East, where the Holy See is worried about the fate of the Christian minority. It was their second meeting since Francis became Pope in 2013, the first since trouble broke out in Ukraine. The Vatican says Francis stressed the need to bring peace to Ukraine through dialogue and implementation of the Minsk Accords. Francis also urged access for humanitarian aid to reach those in need. And Pope Francis approves a new process to hear the cases of bishops accused of failing to protect children from abusive priests. Our Vatican correspondent Alan Holdren is in Rome joining us tonight. Alan, how will this process work?
Well, any complaints made about a bishop go to the office for bishops. There are 3 different ones within the Vatican that take care of bishops throughout the world. Under this new process, the complaints will be sent along to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Pope's Doctrine Office. There, currently, any issues of possible abuse of minors by priests are already investigated and judged. Now, any bishops who have complaints against them will also be investigated there and judged. So this is a new process that the Pope has approved today. The timeline for the implementation of the new section, which they're calling the judicial section within the Doctrine Office, hasn't been defined. It will come about over the course of the next months.
Also, there's a new agreement between the Holy See and the United States government regarding tax evasion. What do you know about that?
That's right. The Vatican, as part of their ongoing transparency measures in issues of finances, has signed this agreement, which they've already signed with another 60 nations on Earth, which will report any tax information on Americans that hold accounts within the Vatican Bank or anywhere else within the Vatican financial structure. So there are only 150 Americans currently that have accounts within the Vatican. It's just 1% of their total. Those people will have all of their taxes reported on the Vatican accounts, also in the United States, Brian.
All right, Alan Holdren in Rome. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Brian.
And the engineer of an Amtrak train that derailed in Philadelphia last month was not talking or texting on his cell phone right before that crash. Investigators still don't know what caused the deadly derailment, and they haven't ruled out that the engineer may have been using an app. Meanwhile, National Transportation Safety Board officials testified today about the use of positive train control. PTC prevents trains from speeding, as was the case in the Philadelphia crash. Congress mandated PTC be installed in all trains by the end of the year.
To do that, we need to be fully engaged with the railroads. We need to have the ability to extend the deadline.
Railroad officials say fewer than a third of commuter railroads will meet that deadline. Well, now in its 5th day, the search for 2 escaped prisoners in upstate New York is door to door. Troopers say the house searches are not due to any new leads. David Sweat and Richard Matt cut their way out of a New York maximum security prison. Police want people to report anything unusual in their neighborhood since the prison break discovered on Saturday. U.S. bishops began their spring meeting in St. Louis today. This is one of 2 times they all meet together during the year. Catherine Szeltner is with our team in St. Louis tonight. Catherine?
Brian, about 250 bishops are here in St. Louis for their spring meeting. They're reviewing, discussing, and debating issues now facing the U.S. Church. Today, they had a packed agenda. Topping the agenda today, recent tensions in Ferguson, Missouri. Protests were held roughly 10 miles from where the bishops are meeting. USCCB President Archbishop Joseph Kurtz calls on Catholics to study the Church's teaching on social justice. He urges them to get to know people in local law enforcement. Next, Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment was addressed by Miami Archbishop Thomas Wenski. Even before its release next week, the teaching document is drawing attention and even some concern. Wenski says care for creation is not a political issue, but a Catholic one.
The whole advantage of the Pope speaking out on the ecology is to transcend politics and partisanship. And so he's going to speak with a different voice, not a voice of a politician, certainly not a voice of a scientist, but a voice of a pastor and a teacher.
Wenski says he hopes Pope Francis connects the dots between a natural ecology and human ecology. For example, he says the redefinition of marriage is an attack on human ecology. Tomorrow morning, the bishops will vote on liturgy revisions in the U.S. Church. They'll also hear from married Catholic couples present in Rome from last October's Synod and the Family. And Brian, the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago was remembered in a special opening dedication today.
All right, Catherine, thanks you and Mark Irons for that report. We'll see you again tomorrow. The Catholic Medical Association, a physicians group, expressing concern about Obamacare. This is in response to the president addressing the Catholic Healthcare Association, representing hospitals and other providers. In a statement, CMA says the Affordable Care Act violates the integrity of the practice of medicine in the United States, undermines the dignity of the human person, and compromises the delivery of Catholic health care. And as the Supreme Court considers a legal challenge to Obamacare, the president insists the High Court should not have taken up the case. Carrie Severino is Chief Counsel and Policy Director for the Judicial Crisis Network. You're calling the president out for gutting the Constitution. How so?
Well, his arguments in this upcoming Obamacare case that we're going to hear about at the end of the month really are asking the court to rewrite the law. The law says you only get subsidies on exchanges established by a state. He wants them to change the meaning of that. That's not the role of the courts. That's the role of Congress. And Congress has already done that. They wrote the law. The courts just interpret it.
He really worked on his case before Catholic health care providers in Washington. Is it significant that he approached it that way?
Well, what he was trying to do was say, this is my moral case for making this argument. But unfortunately, what he did was basically tell the justices that if you don't vote my way, you don't care about your fellow man. And that's really kind of insulting. Also, that's not what the case boils down to. No one in the court, no one in Congress thinks people shouldn't have health care. We don't want to help people get the health care they need. But there's a lot of different ways that legislators go about doing it. And even if the justices were legislators, they could understand that they might have different opinions on whether Obamacare is the right way to do it. After all, it's driving up premiums. It's forcing a lot of people to act against their consciences in cases like the HHS mandate. But the bottom line is they are justices. The moral issue here is, what does the law say? And Jesus said, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. If the law says one thing, that's what the justices need to do, not change the text of it to mean something else.
And our founding fathers specifically set up a system of checks and balances. 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. Why are we seeing such resistance to this basic American principle from this administration?
Because the president doesn't have control over all the other branches of the government. Right now, he only controls the executive branch, and he partly because of things like Obamacare that a lot of people were frustrated about, lost control of Congress, and doesn't have control of the courts, obviously. So when he's trying to advance his policies rather than working together, ideally that's what the checks and balances are supposed to do, make the executive work with the legislator. Let's come together about an agreement. But this president has said, I've got a pen, I've got a phone, I'm going to just maximize what I can do with just this one branch of government.
If the courts rule against him, do you think we'll see a little bit of a different approach?
You know, unfortunately, that's not what we've seen so far. He seems to be playing chicken with people's health care right now, saying we're not going to have any fixes for the subsidies, even though the administration has some tools in their pocket they could use. So, you know, we'll see. Hopefully it brings everyone to the table.
Carrie Severino with the Judicial Crisis Network. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks.
Coming up, we go back to St. Louis, where Cardinal Timothy Dolan previews the upcoming Synod on the family. And Catholics in Russia are such a tiny minority, they're often treated as outsiders in their own country.
La famiglia, possiamo dire, è stata sempre l'ospedale più vicino.
Pope Francis saying today the family has always been the closest hospital. The Holy Father highlighting the hidden heroism of families caring for their loved ones. Thanks for joining us on this June 10th, Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. It's a pleasure to have Cardinal Timothy Dolan of the Archdiocese of New York joining us from the Bishops' Conference there in St. Louis. Cardinal Dolan, what are you and your brother bishops doing to prepare to wrap up the Synod on the family in October?
Well, we're here in St. Louis, and we're going to go to Busch Stadium to a Cardinal ball game, and then we're going to take a walk under the arch. How does that sound, Brian?
Sounds like a great idea.
There's a lot of excitement about the Synod. There's a lot of excitement about the Synod, and the bishops are talking about it. The good news is that the church, God's people, and actually the world is excited about the Synod. The good news is that the Holy Father has emphasized the importance of marriage and family as an extraordinarily high pastoral priority for him and for the church. The good news is that there's a lot of hope and promise, and there's been an immense amount of trust in the sentiments of God's people, with the Pope in an unprecedented way conferring with bishops, priests, religious women and men, and lay faithful throughout the world. Those are all good. We bishops are I'd like to think we're pastorally realistic. We also were a little apprehensive that maybe some people have gotten the idea that this Synod is anything less than what Pope Francis has asked for, namely a providential and spirit-filled occasion to reaffirm the beauty, the dignity, and the sacredness of married life. We like to recall, and we do among ourselves, what Pope Francis said on one of the interviews on an airplane coming home from one of his emotional journeys. And they said, oh, what about the Synod? Is it going to talk about divorced and remarried and a redefinition of marriage? And he said, whoa. He said, I called the Synod to reaffirm the sacredness, the dignity, the biblical understanding of the sacrament of marriage and family, which comes from the sacrament of marriage. So we bishops, although we're immensely grateful for the consultation, the excitement, the attention of the world, we're a little afraid sometimes that this is almost coming across as some type of plebiscite or some type of committee meeting to think about a change in the biblical understanding of marriage, which is impossible and which is anything but the Holy Father's intent. So it'll be fine. It always is. Pope Francis has inspired us to think, in reminding us that the Holy Spirit is in charge. The Holy Spirit can work through confusion, discussion, even arguments, even sometimes misunderstanding. He can bring focus and clarity out. That's what the bishops expect from the Synod.
And the Synod, of course, will immediately follow the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia with the Holy Father here, so we have a lot to look forward to. And I know you have that Cardinals game to get to, Archbishop Dolan, Cardinal Dolan. So root for the Cardinals, and thank you so much for joining us on EWTN News Nightly.
We're glad. My hometown is St. Louis, my hometown. I'm glad I'm here. God bless you.
Go Cardinals. Thank you. That is the first time I've ever rooted for the Cardinals. From poverty relief to nutrition and education, it's been a busy first year for India's Prime Minister. Many Christians believe religious tolerance and affirming basic human rights should take priority. Wyatt Goolsby has that story.
1 year after India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi took office, Christians continue to pray and petition for protection. In the last year, many Indians have accused Modi of failing to do enough to prevent church attacks and vandalism. They say attacks on churches by radical Hindus have increased since Modi's fundamentalist party took power.
Any prime minister in India will have to take all the other minorities on board. And I think Mr. Modi is realizing it.
Hindu hardliners are pushing to expand the country's slaughter ban to include all types of cattle, a move that has left Christian farmers concerned for their futures. Sukhdev Muni also says widespread sex-selective abortions are still a major problem, as many families prefer to have boys over girls.
I think it will take time unless there is a vigorous political campaign being launched, which, to the credit of Mr. Modi, he has launched, that you should save the daughter, you should educate the daughter.
Pro-life, pro-family activist Wendy Wright agrees.
Devaluing of girls overall that drives sex selection abortions and infanticide, and which has resulted in a huge sex imbalance in India. There aren't enough women to be wives. So girls, sometimes teenagers, are kidnapped, trafficked, and sold to be brides.
A reason Wright says people of faith should pray for India and their persecuted minorities. Wyatt Goolsby, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Wyatt. As we reported earlier, Pope Francis met with Russia's president today, and tonight we look at the impact their meeting might have on the small contingent of Catholics in Russia. At Mass in central Moscow, a rare glimpse of a Russian religious minority. For centuries, Russia's Roman Catholics have kept a low profile, often viewed by their Orthodox countrymen with mistrust, as outsiders in their own land.
We don't feel that we have to prove something to someone. We are just there, and we are there for a very long time. And so even if some people here in Russia and in Moscow think that we came from somewhere, that we are aliens, we still don't think that this is true.
But it is true that tensions with the Russian authorities have frequently surfaced. Church officials say Roman Catholic missionaries and priests have had visas revoked for minor infractions, and that the church faces a general atmosphere of unfriendliness. Roman Catholicism is the world's largest Christian denomination, but in Russia, it's just a tiny minority, less than 1% of the entire population. Many Russians want it to stay that way. Some Catholics say they're often seen as unwelcome foreign agents. But there's hope that could now start to change. The Pope and the Russian President have met before in 2013. There's speculation of a first papal visit to Russia may be explored. Father Kirill says that may help heal the ancient rift between the Orthodox and Catholic Church.
I think that the Pope brings with him a certain charisma of love, of understanding, of invitation to dialogue. And I very much hope that when one day the Pope will come to Russia, the same miracle will happen.
a miracle that may bring Russia and the West closer together as well. Up next, is our national security still compromised by an NSA contractor leaking secrets 2 years ago? And mosaics and even a baptismal font are found in the ancient ruins of a church in Jerusalem. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That's Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19 from today's gospel. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. This week marks 2 years since former NSA contractor Edward Snowden acknowledged leaking secrets on surveillance. Fred Fleitz with the Center for Security Policy is a former CIA analyst. And Fred, do you think that Snowden's leaks are still compromising our security today?
I'm afraid so, Brian. What Snowden did is he gave a blueprint to America's most sensitive national security collection programs to America's adversaries. Most of the stuff he leaked had nothing to do with constitutional rights or privacy. It had to deal with going after terrorist groups and America's adversaries, and they have gone to school on these leaks to get around our intelligence services.
Could this have been prevented?
Well, Mr. Snowden was drummed out of the CIA. Most people don't know that, and this is according to the New York Times because he was trying to break into classified systems in Geneva. When he went to the NSA, CIA didn't tell NSA. Someone dropped the ball there. This could have been stopped if CIA had done the right thing and informed the next employee this guy did something wrong.
If he really wanted to do the right thing, weren't there legal avenues that he could and should have taken?
Of course, he could go to his inspector general. He could have come to the intelligence committees. I served on the House Intelligence Committee staff for 5 years. This is a place whistleblowers can go. And I talked to my Democratic counterparts. We both agreed we would have greeted Snowden with open arms and took him to the members of the committee, allowed him to speak to us in confidence and resolve whatever problems it is he had.
Instead, he's hiding out in Russia today.
That bastion of democracy and human rights, where privacy is, of course, protected.
Are there ways to strengthen our surveillance without compromising the privacy of individuals?
Well, I don't think the privacy of individuals were compromised by these programs. I know that's what's generally understood in the media. These programs were carefully overseen by elected representatives of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and the members of these committees on a bipartisan basis supported these programs before and after the Snowden leaks. And it's hard to understand that because of the hysteria caused by the huge number of classified documents that Snowden stole and leaked to the press.
Do you agree with the changes that have been made now with the USA Freedom Act?
Well, I'm concerned that they're going to undermine a crucial national security tool. But I think given the current environment right now, it's the best we can do, and it's my hope that we can resolve whatever problems exist in this program so we can use it to stop terrorist attacks.
So we've learned a little bit from this experience, you think?
I think we learned there's a lot of anti-government sentiment in this country and growing concern about electronic privacy, especially among young people, and this has political implications that no one really understood before. Look at Rand Paul, look at all the politicians who are campaigning on this. It's something we need to factor into our system.
From the Center for Security Policy, Fred Fleitz. Thanks for being with us, Fred.
Good to be here.
Well, construction workers in Jerusalem stumble across the ruins of a 1,500-year-old Byzantine church. The excavation site's director says the church served as a stopover for travelers en route to the Mediterranean coast. Mosaics, ceramic lamps, and even a baptismal font were uncovered.
The significance of this baptisterium is that baptism is the first religious ceremony that a Christian goes through from the day he's born.
Israel's Antiquities Authority says the site will be preserved in consultation with the highway company that unearthed it. Until tomorrow, for the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick, as we leave you tonight with these pictures from today's Wednesday audience with Pope Francis. Good night and God bless you.